One of the biggest surprises of the recent February Nintendo Direct was the inclusion and shadow drop of Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance available for the Nintendo Switch Online service. And this is something that has been rumored to be in development for a while, and in fact in April of last year on this channel we talked about a 4chan leak of a GBA emulator that was known as Sloop. This was said to be developed by Nintendo Europe R&D department internally, and in that episode we discussed its legitimacy as the leak did come from 4chan, and there was some other interesting aspects, including the now infamous picture of an Easy Flash ROM cartridge, which seemed a little off given Nintendo's stance against ROMs. However, the conclusion of that video was that I did believe that it was legitimate, as the leak did come with commit history information that seemed to be pretty compelling evidence. What we didn't know, however, was we'd actually see Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and GBA appear on the service in February. I personally believed that it would probably launch in September of 2023, as it's usually around the time where Nintendo announces NSO updates in this fashion. But it's out now, and from my few hours of playing around with both Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and the GBA, this is pretty impressive stuff, and much better than when Nintendo launched the N64 service on the NSO. Now let's first talk about Game Boy and Game Boy Color emulation. I'm quite familiar with these systems, having worked on my own Game Boy Color port of Shantae on the Nintendo Switch. Now these initial batch of games that are available include Super Mario Land 2 6 Gold Coins, which is a pretty decent game, The Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening DX, which is a top tier game, fantastic game, Gargoyle's Quest, a pretty decent game, Game & Watch Gallery 3, Alone in the Dark, The New Nightmare, Metroid 2 Return of Samus, another game that I really like as a Metroid fan, Wario Land 3, which is a pretty good game, and Kirby's Dream Land, which is a great game. Now these are pretty decent as far as the initial launch of games. As well, there's a mix of Game Boy and Game Boy Color games here, which is a nice touch. For example, Link's Awakening DX is the updated version of the original DMG release, which takes advantage of the Game Boy Color's enhanced hardware and color palettes. But what I really like about this Game Boy implementation for the NSO is that Nintendo did just about everything right. This is very impressive emulation. Now, it's easy just to disregard Game Boy as a system that's old and very easy to emulate, but this is not necessarily true. There's many edge cases that are associated with good Game Boy emulation, and it also has a few quirks about it, and it's easy for things to go pear-shaped. But the good news is Nintendo most certainly put the work in. First of all, let's talk about screen resolution. The original Game Boy runs at a native resolution of 160 by 144 pixels. When you launch the Game Boy games by default, you'll note that it's using the entire screen vertically. This is because the Nintendo Switch is running the NSO in handheld mode at 720p, and the screen is integer scaled at 5 times for exactly 800 by 720. When docked, the resolution switches to 1080p for a 7x increase to 1120 by 1008. But because we have a horizontal resolution of 1080, there is a small gap in the borders on either side. Integer scaling is absolutely essential when building emulators for systems that have low native resolutions and are tile-based, because any deviation away introduces shimmering when scrolling, for example. As an example of this, if you take a look at this emulator where I've deliberately stretched out the screen horizontally by a couple of pixels, you can see that the trees are shimmering in the background. They're kind of jumping, and this is not the right thing. This is very jarring, and someone that is familiar with the original hardware will notice this immediately. Nintendo also provides the option called Display with a Small Screen option, and this reduces the resolution to just 3x. It's smaller, but it's still integer scaled, and once again, this is the correct approach. With correct integer scaling means filters can be applied that will look correct as well. The NSO Game Boy implementation has an option known as Reproduce Classic Feel. This is a very nice filter option that provides a dot matrix filter to replicate the original Game Boy screen, but it also emulates the ghosting of the original hardware as well. If we take a look at this example with the options turned off compared to it enabled, you can see the differences. It's very much more faithful to how the original hardware looked, and if we freeze frame right here, you can see how it's held a copy of the previous frame but reduced alpha on the current frame. There's also the option to select from 3 separate color palettes. These are Game Boy, which replicates the original Game Boy DMG palette, Game Boy Pocket, and Game Boy Color, which adds color to original Game Boy games such as Metroid 2 here. These are quite faithful to the original. Now, I understand that I'm getting into nitpick territory here, but to my eyes, the filters that are applied to the NSO are still not quite right. When we compare it to the Analog Pocket, you can see that they're maybe just a little washed out, but to be perfectly honest with you, we're comparing a $20 service on the Nintendo Switch to a boutique FPGA product that costs $190 and is considered very high-end. So it's a bit of an unfair comparison, but I would like to see Nintendo just tweak those filters just a bit to get it to be more accurate as a representation to the original Game Boy. But what we have here is just about right. And look, if they don't make any changes to this at all, then I'm still pretty happy, because overall it looks quite good, especially on the OLED screen where it really does pop. Moving on to the Game Boy Advance, things are great here as well. For the screen resolution, the GBA uses a native 240 by 160 res, but this doesn't divide evenly into 720 or 1080. So a 4x integer scale is applied to boost the resolution to 960 by 640. Once again, there are visible borders on either side of the GBA screen, but this does look pretty cool. Now, what's also interesting is the option to display smaller screen, just like the Game Boy. But this is only a 2x increase. Now, most people probably won't bother with this mode, but the reason why it's here is because one of the drawbacks of the GBA when multiplying its internal resolution is that games can start looking quite blocky. So this resolution certainly helps. However, the GBA also contains its own filter option as well, and I must say it looks fantastic. It helps quite a lot with the blockiness of the GBA screen, and it looks very, very close to my backlit GBA. This is a really cool touch. Now, as far as emulation accuracy is concerned, the Game Boy Advance emulation on the NSO is one of the most accurate around. And if you take a look at one of the tweets by Luigi Blood on February the 10th, you can see here that the GBA emulation was run through what was known as the AGS test suite. And this is basically just a test ROM which runs a whole bunch of different tests, including the memory, the LCD timers, DMA, inputs, interrupts, all sorts of random tests to basically let your emulator know how accurate you are, and it will give it a pass or a fail. And as you can see, the GBA emulation here has actually passed the entire test suite. It's the only one outside of a couple of hobbyist emulators such as Nano Boy Advance and Sky Emu. So this is a credit to Nintendo for really spending the time and care and attention to put together a very accurate Game Boy Advance experience on the Nintendo Switch, and I'm very, very happy to see this. Now, another really cool feature of Game Boy Advance running on the NSO is the rumble toggle in some of the games. So as a backstory, some games that ran via the GBA player for the GameCube would actually support rumble using the GameCube controller. And two of these games that are on the service, Mario Advance 4 and Superstar Saga, are two of these games, and these work totally fine with rumble. And this is just one of those really nice little cool extra touches that you kind of don't really expect for it to work, but it does, and it's actually very surprising and actually really cool to see. And this is one area where I feel like Nintendo is going to continue to add these little extras that people remember back in the day that you wouldn't really expect to work with the NSO service, but Nintendo seems like they're doing some work here to really kind of bring the old experience that you remember back to the Nintendo Switch. So this is a list of all the games that were dumped as part of the Sloop leak back in 2021, and this contains all the games that have currently been released for the Nintendo Switch Online service, but there are some games here that are obviously not on the list, and if we can speculate for a moment, it's possible that some of these games that are on this list may end up releasing at a later stage. Of course, it's Nintendo, and this is just a snapshot in time from 2021, and things can certainly change, but the potential of getting Yoshi's Island, as well as Pokemon Pinball, Ninja 5-0, Mr. Driller, Metroid Zero Mission, Mega Man 03, and other games here you can see on this list, potentially coming to the Game Boy Advance service later on, is quite interesting to think about. And hopefully Nintendo will continue to support both of these services. I know that they haven't really committed to a release date of anything beyond what they talked about in the Nintendo Direct, and they didn't really give any indication of release dates going forward. But I'd like to think that some of these games on this list at least will end up on this service, and I think that's really cool. But let me know what you guys think about the Game Boy and Game Boy Advance and Game Boy Color for the Nintendo Switch Online service. I think Nintendo has knocked this out of the park. I'll be completely honest with you. After the pretty much failure of the Nintendo 64 service when it launched, it took them a long time to get that in a good place, but this one is very much polished. It works extremely well, and I can't wait to see what the future holds for both of these services on the NSO, because there's a lot of potential here for some amazing games. The GBA library is phenomenal. The Game Boy library is phenomenal. Game Boy Color has some great games as well. So I'm very, very excited about the future of the NSO service, and I think Nintendo did an amazing job here, and I give them full credit. But we're going to leave it here for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.